from New York One, the city and the world in 15 minutes. This is Nonstop News.
A new effort to limit bilingual education in the city may be in the works. Education reporter J.D. LaRock has details.
Teach new immigrants, kids who are new to the country, English as quickly as possible.
That's the top priority of parents when it comes to bilingual education, according to a recent survey by the nonpartisan group Public Agenda. The group polled more than 800 parents here in the city and across the country. When asked what the public schools should do first for students who are new immigrants, 67% of parents say the school should teach immigrants English, even if it means they fall behind in other subjects. 27% of parents say schools should teach immigrant students in their native language, even if it means they take longer to learn English. Among foreign-born parents, the numbers are even more pronounced. 3/4 say immigrant students should learn English before all else, while 21% support teaching kids in their native tongue. Steve Farkas, one of the authors of the study, says immigrant parents are no longer looking to bilingual education as a way to preserve their family's native culture.
For immigrant parents, there was a sense, and Hispanic parents, there was a sense that we can take care of that at home. That keeping close to our culture, our native culture, holding on to our original language is something we can do at home, that parents are responsible for. But the public schools are responsible for teaching English so that our kids can thrive in the society and they're not held back.
But now the survey may become ammunition for some who want to limit bilingual education here in New York. The New York Times reports that Ron Unz, one of the backers of Proposition 227 in California, is thinking of launching a similar effort here in the city. Proposition 227 severely curtailed bilingual ed in California and pushed immigrant students into English immersion classes. Unz, who lives in California, could not be reached for comment Monday, but advocates for bilingual education students are warning him to keep his act out of New York.
This is being led and fought through not by people who really have an expertise in education. These are people who are making a political hay out of a Latino issue. Who are they to come into our communities? This guy Unz. What does he know about Latinos? What does he know about education?
Advocates in the Asian community also caution against limiting bilingual ed. Like Latino advocates, they say the better solution is to improve programs that currently exist.
Right now, it looks like studies are very conflicting. There are some that do say a student needs 2 to 3 years to learn English well. And given the fact that research says different things, I think it's very, very dangerous to say we should immediately do away with the entire system.
As for the Board of Education, they say they do plan to offer more English classes to bilingual education students. Thanks to a new state requirement, all students, including bilingual ed students, have to pass the English Regents examination in order to graduate from high school. As a result, the board...
This is the news leader, ABC 7 Eyewitness News.
There's a new study that may increase the debate over bilingual education in public schools. The idea is to quickly mainstream students into English-speaking classrooms. But after 3 years of bilingual education, many simply are not ready. Celeste Ford is here with this story. Celeste?
Diana, until now, the Board of Education didn't have a real sense of how quickly immigrant children are learning English. It spent 7 years studying the issue and today issued this thick report. It says only half the students test out of the remedial programs within the recommended time frame of 3 years. 16% of city students are English language learners. The Board of Ed report says the younger they are, the better their outlook, with 2/3 of kindergarten students mastering the language within 3 years. But if they haven't learned English by middle school, they're not likely to graduate. This principal says she's not surprised.
Language acquisition is a long-term process. It's 5 to 7 years before a child can learn his academics in a new language.
But some of the new findings are disturbing by any measure. Among first graders, 22% remained in specialized classes after 8 years. When looking at sixth graders, 55% were still in the classes after 7 years. The report does not address immersion. That's the controversial crash course approach to English. A recent report says it's getting results in California, raising questions about its potential here.
It has been around for many, many years. However, how much time are you dedicating to immersion? And how much are you excluding from the curriculum as you immerse the children?
Right now, her students are placed in English as a second language, which offers remedial help, or bilingual classes, with English phased in gradually. The report says each is effective unless students are switched back and forth. This education advocate says that happens all the time.
You wouldn't take children and teach them the old math one year and the new math the next and expect them to thrive in math. It's the same issue.
There are a number of reasons English language learners are shuttled around, including parental choice. Schools Chancellor Harold Levy just ordered his superintendents to stop this practice. The report also called for extra services in the middle and high schools so these kids can meet the new graduation requirements. They have to take the Regents exams.
Sure. Okay. Thank you very much, Celeste.
5, 4, 3, roll deck 5, track.
Good evening. I'm Richard French, and this is The Big Story. America was founded on the principle of equality for everyone, including a solid educational foundation for every child. Bilingual education programs were established in the 1960s to make sure that immigrants did not get left behind academically. But studies now are coming out that show that these bilingual classes are not as successful as once thought. Tonight, we want to know if you think the bilingual education system is detrimental to the learning progress of non-native speakers, or do you think a slower immersion into the English language is a better way for children to assimilate into the American culture? We want to welcome our guest to the program here tonight in just a second, but first, let's take a look at the history of this very controversial education system in our country. And between 1920 and 1960, there was English immersion, and is popularly called the sink or swim policy. Changed in 1968. In 68, Bilingual Education Act recognized the educational disadvantage that were faced by non-English speaking students. And in 1963, going back a little bit, success of bilingual program for Cuban refugees in Florida inspired similar programs. Fast forward here a little bit, in '74, Congress passed the Equal Educational Opportunity Act, ruling that identical education does not constitute equal education. What this really meant, quite simply, was, you know what, just because it's equal education, you've got to provide here different languages, and you have to give these kids the equal chances. In '67, Governor Ronald Reagan here, remember, obviously Republican governor, he signed the bill eliminating English-only instructional mandate. And in '98, under Proposition 227, moving forward, 1.4 million students are mainstreamed into classes after 1 year of English instruction. Interesting to note here, Republican governor in California at the time, this was very popular in the '60s here. This was something that would basically equal out the playing field. And if you also know, we are now in the age where we're reanalyzing a lot of these beliefs. Welfare was reformed here. Most people look back and say it was a success. Now the issue of bilingual education. Should it be left as it is, or should we change it? California, we're going to be talking about successes and or failures of ending the bilingual educational system, and get to your phone calls in just a second. I want to now welcome our guest, and we are now joined by the co-author of Proposition 227 and the chairman of English for Children, Ron Unz, who you saw in that piece earlier. In addition to Mr. Unz, we're also joined by the director of the Education and Child Welfare Program for the Reason Public Policy Institute, Lisa Snell, who joins us on the phone line. Thank you, both of you, for joining me this evening.
Great to be here.
It's an interesting debate, and I guess as we're sitting here in 2000, if we went back in '96, '97 to have this debate, I guess, Mr. Unz, you would have been labeled as pretty arch-conservative here without the consideration of the children in mind. Now that you see some of the results that have come out of California, do you feel vindicated in any way?
Well, yeah, I think I feel vindicated, and I think the vast majority of Californians who voted for the measure also feel vindicated. I really think there never was much support for native language instruction among any groups in the broad public, and it was kept in place simply because a very small number of people worked in the bilingual education industry and wanted to keep the program going.
Lisa, let me ask you, were you surprised by some of the results, and these were taken by nonpartisan groups here, as to how these children have performed in the last couple of years out of California since it was basically put in a sink or swim policy after a year of transition?
No, not surprised at all. In fact, Smaller pilot programs indicate that when children are immersed in English only, that their test scores tend to go up. So there were even before Proposition 227, there were obviously other research that indicated that that program worked well for immigrant children.
So let me ask you, Lisa, do you think that there still is a role here for a bilingual education, or do you think the system needs to be changed and modified? We see, obviously, what happened in California. It's been discussed that in New York and other states here, they could soon be following the lead of California. Should it stay as status quo, or should it be changed?
Well, I think one of the things that needs to be changed is, in general, the idea that school districts are mandated to have a specific program. And in many cases with bilingual education in New York, and certainly the way it was before in California, bilingual education was the only way. And so there was only one choice. And I think that's what needs to be changed, where there's mandates. Now, most of the evidence points to the fact that bilingual education doesn't work. And I think certainly what's happened in California, and also the other study that was recently released in New York, supports the idea that students that are taught in English, whether it's English immersion or English as a second language classes that aren't bilingual, tend to be performing better. So I think as a national trend, we tend to see people replicate programs that work, and so moving away from bilingual education will probably happen.
But do you still feel there is a role here for bilingual education, or do you think that it should be strictly an immersion type of educational system?
Well, I don't think that you can mandate and make everyone everywhere have to go to an English-only program at the state level. I mean, I think that there has to be room for some local decision-making, but on the other hand, most bilingual education programs are state mandates, and certainly when you have the initiative process, the people themselves are mandating their choice on what they think works.
Ron, let me bring you back into this. If you asked me a couple of years ago, I probably would have been one of the people who said it's not fair to the kids here to pull the rug out from under them and force them to learn a system. They're going to get turned off by the educational system. They won't really be on the same footing, obviously, as the kids who've spoken English their whole lives here, and they're going to be turned off and probably increase the dropout rates. I've changed my opinion a little bit with these studies, but is it fair to just look at the black and white numbers? Some people say class sizes have been decreased, and there's a lot of factors that go into the performance of these kids in California, and it can't just be labeled that it is all immersion into the classroom.
I'd be the last one to claim that Proposition 227 is the only reason the test scores moved up so rapidly. Now, actually, class size reduction was not a significant factor. In fact, there were studies showing the impact of class size reduction was probably only about 5% or 10% of the improvement in test scores. In other words, it was a fairly negligible factor. The other large factor besides the switch to English immersion was getting rid of whole language and switching over to phonics, because whole language just doesn't work very well and phonics works much better. The ironic thing about it is all the supporters of bilingual education are also supporters of whole language. So they were opposed to both of those changes, and I think they were proven wrong on both grounds. But I really do believe that certainly the increase in test scores was in very significant part caused by eliminating bilingual education. And one sign of it is those school districts in California that tried to keep their bilingual programs showed minimal improvement in test scores. And those that most completely eliminated bilingual education, notably Oceanside down near San Diego, districts like that doubled their test scores in less than 2 years, which is quite remarkable.
Now, let me ask you, one of the byproducts of going to an immersion program here is the reduction in terms of cost that has to go in. You're obviously going to cut down on all of the separate classes that have to go into place here for bilingual education, and in some reports it's a third of the cost if you had bilingual education. Do you suggest here that that money, that savings, be poured back into the schools in terms of additional tutoring here, additional after-school programs, so when the kids find, as they will in all cases in that first 6 months, that roadblock, they're helped and encouraged to stay into it, or do you think the savings should be passed on to the taxpayers?
Well, first of all, there isn't really that large savings. In other words, different studies have come to different conclusions. But remember, the students in a bilingual classroom are being taught, in a sense, in a similar classroom to a non-bilingual or non-Spanish-oriented classroom. Now, the books are a little bit more expensive, and sometimes they have to pay the teachers a little bit more, but the cost saving is not that gigantic. And in fact, our initiative, Proposition 227, required that the extra money be spent still on those same students, in other words, the immigrant students who don't know English very well, and simply used to improve the program or provide, for example, slightly smaller class size or slightly better materials. But again, the cost savings are not that dramatic. I mean, that is not the best reason to oppose bilingual education, that it costs a huge amount of extra money. The best reason to oppose it is it just doesn't really work compared with English immersion.
One of the, at least to me, one of the most startling numbers that came out in the polls was one of the groups that is the strongest proponent of immersion are the immigrants themselves. In fact, we're putting up a number that came through from the public agenda that 75% of recent immigrants oppose bilingual education here. And I guess the feelings was that they want the next generation to do better, right?
Absolutely. In other words, many immigrant parents know perfectly well that if they knew English a little bit better, if they could read and write English better, they could get a much better job in our society. And they certainly want their children to be taught English as much as possible by the schools. In fact, Proposition 227 originally began when I read a series of articles in Los Angeles Times about a group of immigrant parents in downtown Los Angeles, Latino garment workers, who actually had to start a public boycott of their own local elementary school because it refused to teach their children English. And when a system has reached the point where parents have to carry picket signs because a school refuses to allow their children to learn English, I felt something had to be done about it. All the national polls have shown that the vast, vast majority of immigrant parents oppose native language instruction and want their children taught English as quickly as possible. In fact, one of the parts of 227 that also is very helpful in California is that it takes some of the money saved by eliminating bilingual education and puts it into funding for adult English literacy programs so that, for example, some of the parents of those children can learn English as well. And that way, when the parents and children are both learning English, they can help each other.
Now, obviously, everyone's touting on both sides the success of the program in California. It's been more than rumored, and in fact, you're on record as saying that this should be taken nationwide. Have you, how about New York here specifically? I know you talked about how the city political structure works. It would be pretty difficult for it to pass through New York, right?
Right. Now, actually, I've helped already a group of people in Arizona, parents and teachers and community activists, put a similar initiative on the ballot, which they'll be voting on in just a few weeks, and I think it'll win. I really think it would be tremendously beneficial to try to do something about the failed bilingual programs in New York, and I'm very pessimistic about the state legislature taking any action on this, because the bilingual teachers and the bilingual administrators and the bilingual coordinators and the bilingual academics tend to have a stranglehold on the political process. On the other hand, I do think while it's difficult to put something on the ballot in New York City dealing with this issue, I think it definitely might be worth the effort. And I've already been talking with a few people in New York about possibly working with them to move something like this forward, which I think would be tremendously beneficial.
Lisa, let me ask you before I let you go, do you see any reasons to give you pause here as to move away from the bilingual education in toto, or do you think that there should be at least more of a phasing in period?
No, I think the evidence overwhelmingly points to English immersion as the right way to go. I mean, the problem with programs like bilingual education is that they don't have any kind of accountability for student achievement. And with the English immersion programs in California, you have huge scrutiny where everyone was saying, oh, it's going to fail. And everyone was looking closely at what would happen. And it's amazing because usually when you change something, it takes a couple years for it to get up and going and show positive results. But of course, here we've seen dramatic results. And just to put it in perspective, when you have other kinds of reform programs like Title I, which educates remedial education students, if they have 3 percentage point gains with remedial students, which are largely minorities, a lot of the same LEP students, limited English students, they count that as success. So when you're seeing 20 percentage points gains, and I think, again, the evidence has always been here. There's other programs where they have English immersion. So really, I think...
So you have no reason to have any pause. Lisa and Ron, I got to jump to a commercial break, but I want to thank you both for joining me tonight.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
When we come back, we're going to go to your phone calls. Not on lines already, 888 RNN chat. We'll also take a look at some viewer emails as well. Stay with us.
This is the news leader, ABC 7 Eyewitness News.
Tonight, a heated debate over the future of bilingual education, and it could lead to major changes for thousands of New York City school children. Good evening, I'm Bill Butel.
And I'm Diana Williams. The mayor's task force says parents of bilingual children should have a new option.
That option is called Immersion, a program in which non-English speaking children would be put directly into English-only classes. Bilingual education is a difficult, emotional issue. Celeste Ford is here now with the story. Celeste.
Bill, today we saw the start of the city's latest bilingual battle. The head of a mayoral task force wants to shake up the status quo by giving parents the option of placing their children in regular English-only classes, a practice known as immersion. Opponents say something has to be done to fix bilingual, but it's not immersion. The public hearing included many of the key voices in the bilingual debate. This man, Ron Unz, is the most controversial. The businessman led the campaign that ended bilingual education in California.
There has never been a single case in the United States in the last 30 years, anywhere in America, of an example of a large-scale, successful bilingual program.
Unz, who was heckled by the crowd, says test scores show that immersion works. He was invited to attend this hearing by the head of the mayor's bilingual task force, Randy Mastro, who's lobbying to make immersion an option for students in New York City.
By doing that, we empower the parents and the children. And to me, this should be an uncontroversial proposition.
But it is controversial because roughly 1 out of every 6 students is enrolled in bilingual education, and by all accounts, the costly programs aren't working. This morning, a Board of Ed spokesman testified that only half the students master English within 3 years, as required by state law. Away from the hearing, the mayor weighed in, suggesting bilingual education be limited to only 2 years.
The purpose of it being to teach you English, not, 10, 12 years in school in a foreign language.
The mayor would not comment on immersion. Same for schools Chancellor Levy, a member of the task force. But this leader of the opposition said the proposal is loaded with racial and political overtones.
Because I think it scored points with that element of our population that's more conservative and that actually fear Latinos. They fear Latinos, and they see bilingual programs as something that is empowering Latinos.
Then there are the bilingual students who say the immersion option is unrealistic.
It's going to be so difficult, and probably the students are going to fail the classes.
They'll fail their classes?
Yes.
Compare that to the mother who demanded English-only classes for her son.
I put my son in a regular class, and it worked for my son. I'm happy with that.
This is far from a done deal. The task force recommendations expected by the end of the month would need some Board of Ed approvals. But with a green light, English-only immersion could be an option for immigrant children as early as next September. Bill, Diana?
Well, Celeste, thanks very much.
Thank you, Celeste.
From the heart of the tri-state area, street level on 5th Avenue, you're watching News 2.
Bilingual education is designed to help teach students who aren't familiar with the English language, but the public seems to be souring on the program, leaving critics claiming the classes are nothing more than double talk. News 2 reporter David Diaz takes a closer look.
It was billed as a hearing about the achievements and problems of the city's massive bilingual education program, though critics of the panel appointed by the mayor denounced it as a planned hatchet job designed to turn public opinion against the program, which originally grew out of a lawsuit on behalf of Spanish-speaking children, but now serves immigrant children from dozens of linguistic backgrounds. Juan Figueroa heads the Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund.
That I come to you today to express our utter outrage and disgust with the Giuliani administration's apparent efforts to needlessly politicize this issue and polarize New Yorkers on bilingual education in New York City.
Nevertheless, the hearing produced statistics to both support and criticize the program. For example, less than 50% of the students move into mainstream classes in 3 years, which they're supposed to do. On the other hand, the earlier they enter such programs, the sooner they make that move. And, as the head of the Board of Ed's research unit pointed out,
but overall they're doing exceedingly well once they do exit.
at the same time, a parade of immigrant parents testified how the program had failed their children and how the schools forced their kids into bilingual classes against the parents' wishes. Rosario Carrasco, speaking through a translator, described her daughter's abysmal experience.
I am not against bilingual education. What hurts and what I ask myself is how could my daughter have spent 5 years in bilingual education and not have learned enough English to pass a reading test?
And what's crazy about all of this is that the lawyer for the Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund, which monitors the consent decree that set up bilingual education programs in the city, says that what the schools have been doing to those parents is illegal. At City Hall, David Diaz, News 2.
You're watching NBC4, the Tri-State News Channel. And now, Chuck Scarborough, Michelle Marsh, Janice Huff, and Len Berman. This is News Channel 4 at 6.
All right, Janice. Bilingual education, teaching kids in their native language. It's a hot topic these days. Opponents say it's not working and claim children would be better off being immersed in English. There was a stormy hearing at City Hall today. Education reporter Carol Ann Riddell was there.
Bilingual education is a stepping stone when it functions the way it should. But when it doesn't, it becomes a prison that condemns children.
A prison, critics argue, because too many children who don't speak English are trapped in bilingual classes for years on end. Bilingual education is intended to be a transition period during which children are taught in their native language. But at a packed City Hall hearing today, even Board of Ed officials testified that is not always the case. Only about half of students leave bilingual programs in 3 years.
Students are exiting in 4, 5, and 6 years. There is a core of students, however, who have been in the programs for 8 and 9 years. And it's those students that we're concerned about.
So what's the answer? Some say an English immersion program. Teaching kids in English should be an option for families. Randy Mastro heads Mayor Giuliani's task force on bilingual education. He says the idea is not to do away with bilingual classes, but to give parents another alternative.
We all care about the same thing, helping our kids perform better, helping improve their educations. One of the ways that we can do that is to give parents more information and give them more choices.
Bilingual education doesn't work. English immersion does work.
Some of the most controversial testimony came from Ron Unz. He spearheaded the effort to dismantle bilingual education in California. Opponents say English only is not the solution.
When it comes to this problem with bilingual ed, the solution should be exactly what we propose for every other area where things aren't working. Make the programs work.
The task force hopes to issue an initial report and recommendations by the end of this month. The ultimate goal, getting changes in place by the start of the next school year. At City Hall, Carol Ann Riddell, News Channel 4.
Now, from New York One, the city and the world in 15 minutes, this is Non-Stop News.
With a mayoral panel pushing for reform, the school chancellor appears set to endorse a compromise on bilingual education. Education reporter J.D. Lawak has the exclusive story.
Mayor Giuliani wants to begin moving students from bilingual education to classes taught in English. Manhattan Board of Ed member Irving Hamer wants students to get better services in bilingual ed. And schools chancellor Harold Levy is trying to please them both. New York One has learned the chancellor will propose a compromise reform plan to the Board of Ed Wednesday. In part, Levy is pushing a version of the Giuliani plan called informed consent, where parents would be given the final decision as to how their children are educated.
I'm trying very hard to set the political context to one side. What I need to do as a schools chancellor is satisfy myself what the right answer is. What's in the interest of the children? What makes sense?
Levy discussed the plan with a group of bilingual ed advocates Tuesday, and some are critical. They say the chancellor should strengthen existing programs first before expanding parental choice.
Well, it's great to have an informed consent policy, but it really doesn't make any sense until you fix the problems that you know exist with the current programs. Or you introduce new programs with plenty of money so you can take care of both.
But advocates say they are glad that so far Levy isn't embracing another Giuliani recommendation, full-scale English immersion classes. City Hall sources say the chancellor does support a type of immersion where English is used to a greater degree in English as a second language classes. But when asked about immersion directly, Levy wouldn't respond.
What I'm ever so delicately trying to say is I need to talk to the Board of Education before I say anything publicly.
Board member Irving Hamer says Levy has agreed to support a number of his recommendations. They include improving programs for students in bilingual ed and special ed, improving programs for older bilingual ed students, ending the practice of moving students from bilingual ed to ESL programs, and using a new test to measure students' progress. This issue is far from settled. Some of Levy's proposals would require changes to a court order governing bilingual education, and that is by no means assured. Moreover, the Board of Ed makes the final decision about whether to adopt Levy's plan, and at this point, it's not clear what board members think of it. In Manhattan, J.D. LaRock, New York 1.
This is the news leader, ABC 7 Eyewitness News.
Sweeping changes in store for thousands of New York City's bilingual students. The mayor's task force unveils a dramatic shift in teaching a hotly debated subject and putting the brakes on teenage driving. We'll show you a life-saving new plan to slowly let teens take the wheel. It is tonight's Eyewitness News Extra. Good evening to you. I'm David Ushery. Bill Butel is off tonight.
And I'm Diana Williams. 1 out of 6 New York City school children is enrolled in some type of bilingual education. But a lot of people say that the current bilingual program is simply not working. Now a 2-year mayoral task force has come up with a dramatic new plan, and Celeste Ford is here now with details. Celeste.
Diana, after months of speculation, the bilingual debate in New York City is coming to a head. The mayor's task force released its recommendations today. It amounts to a shakeup, but falls short of a controversial sink or swim immersion plan. For a school system where only half the students test out of bilingual education within 3 years, a state requirement, fundamental changes are in the works.
Bilingual education was originally intended as a means to an end. Instead, it has become an end in itself.
The task force chairman says students are languishing in bilingual education. His report recommends creating a new option, a high-intensity English program to mainstream children into regular classes within 1 year, and a new policy. Schools would give parents a choice when selecting bilingual programs instead of automatically placing their children.
They should be the ones who have the real say in what they want for their children, because a lot of parents want different things for their children.
The report calls for the recruitment of more qualified bilingual teachers. Right now, 27% lack state certification. The report also suggests after-school and summer school help.
Can the programs work? Yes, of course they can work, and they've been shown to work. The question is how and where, and can we bring them up to work well?
The school's chancellor is a member of the mayor's task force. He will present his bilingual report to the Board of Ed tomorrow. A copy obtained by Eyewitness News shows that it's similar to the task force report. Critics say either plan would undermine bilingual ed.
The new program would take away resources from the programs that exist that already are in crisis.
But many parents don't want the traditional bilingual education.
They really don't learn English, so they have, many problems in learning.
The mayor said the recommended changes are practical, but don't really go far enough. He says that's because a federal ruling requires the city to offer bilingual education. The Board of Ed is supposed to vote on this matter this week, and the changes could go into effect next fall. Those are big changes for New York City.
Yeah.
Indeed. All right. Thank you, Celeste.
Watching New York One News all morning.
School Chancellor Harold Levy is set to disclose details of his plan to revamp bilingual education in the city. Yesterday, the mayor made his own recommendations on the issue. Our education reporter J.D. LaRock has more.
Mayor Giuliani said he wanted to radically reform bilingual education, but on Monday he released a plan that doesn't go as far as some expected.
The mayor is not calling for full-scale English immersion classes across the board. However, he does want parents to have the option of enrolling their children in intensive English classes.
For people to get the benefit of America who come here from other places in order to get the benefit of America, they have to really, in addition to keeping their own culture, they have to learn American culture. And they have to learn the American language and be able to use it effectively.
When more than 50% of our children in bilingual programs are not transitioning into the mainstream classroom within 3 years, which is the state standard, the system is failing those kids.
The mayor's task force also wants an accelerated program for bilingual ed students so most can get out within 3 years. It's calling for an expanded bilingual summer school program and measures to recruit, train, and certify more bilingual ed teachers. Finally, the task force wants a system of informed parental consent, so parents, not schools, have the final say as to whether their kids should be placed in bilingual ed. Latino advocates who had feared massive cuts to existing programs say they haven't reviewed the plan in detail. But so far, they like what they see.
It seems like these folks are wanting to improve on what we have, and to that extent, or to the extent that they're not saying, let's do away with bilingual education, that the framework that they're following is a good one.
Schools Chancellor Harold Levy served on the mayor's task force. He says he agrees with the recommendations, but also plans to offer others. Sources say Levy intends to endorse a number of reforms proposed by Manhattan Board of Ed member Irving Hamer. They include better programs for older bilingual ed students, an end to the practice of moving students between bilingual ed and English as a second language programs, better services for students in bilingual ed and special ed, and new tests to measure student progress.
We want the children to speak English. On that, there is no disagreement.
Latino advocates say they'll meet with members of the Board of Education to make sure there are no last-minute changes. If the Board of Ed approves the reform plan, it could become official city policy this September. In Manhattan, J.D. LaRock, New York 1.
Live from the New York studios of the WB11, this is the WB11 News at 10.
There are an estimated 160,000 bilingual students speaking more than 145 different languages and dialects in New York City's public schools. Well, after months of studying how the school system is dealing with these children, the mayor's task force on bilingual education today handed the school's bilingual program a failing grade. Pauline Liu reports.
When it comes to bilingual education, the city's school system is flunking out. That scathing accusation is being made by the mayor's task force on bilingual education, which is now calling for extensive reforms. Task force members were shocked to learn that some bilingual teachers are not bilingual themselves, and that many bilingual students have failed to go mainstream within 3 years as required by law. Former Deputy Mayor Randy Mastro is task force chairman.
And the most shocking statistic, it seems to me, here is that after 9 years, there are still nearly 18% of our children who entered a bilingual program in kindergarten who remain in such a program as they enter high school.
The core is to give a lot more choices to parents. They should be the ones deciding the kind of bilingual education program.
Parents like Jean Castillo, who moved her 13-year-old son from the Dominican Republic to Bushwick, Brooklyn 3 years ago, and then had to fight to get him into English-speaking classrooms.
I want him learning English, not learning Spanish, because he is already Spanish. You know?
The task force recommends the creation of a fast-track program aimed at getting bilingual education students into mainstream classrooms within a year, using new instruction techniques and smaller class sizes. A summer school English language program is also being proposed for bilingual students who are not making the grade. These students can enroll in summer school or after-school and weekend programs in English.
Can the programs work? Yes, of course they can work, and they've been shown to work. The question is how and where, and can we bring them up to work well?
The school's chancellor, who is a task force member, plans to present his own recommendations to the Board of Education tomorrow. Any changes are likely to take effect next September. In Manhattan, I'm Pauline Liu for the WB11 News at 10.
You're watching NBC4, the Tri-State News Channel. And now, Chuck Scarborough, Michelle Marsh, Janice Huff, and Len Berman. This is News Channel 4 at 6.
And an education overhaul. A dramatic change is expected in the way bilingual school children are taught. Good evening. A potential shakeup for thousands of New York City's bilingual students is just moments away.
The Board of Education is meeting right now and is scheduled to take up a vote that would give parents more control over their children's placement in bilingual education programs. Education reporter Carol Ann Riddell is live at the Board of Education headquarters in downtown Brooklyn right now. Carol Ann?
Well, Chuck, in a matter of minutes, the board will vote on what could be historic reform of bilingual education. It's a program that's been controversial across the country. Those who defend it say children who don't speak English need that transition time during which they're taught in their native language. But critics argue bilingual classes can become a crutch, even preventing children from learning English. Tonight, the Board of Ed hopes to hammer out a compromise. Bilingual education, it's supposed to be a transition period during which children are taught in their native language. But for years, parents have complained bilingual ed doesn't work because too many students end up staying in the program indefinitely, even as long as 8 or 9 years. This latest proposal could change that dramatically. It would end the automatic placement of students in traditional bilingual classes, giving parents choices, including an accelerated English program, a new option for parents who want their children taught primarily in English. The goal, for kids to speak English in 3 years. Randy Mastro chaired Mayor Giuliani's task force on bilingual education.
This is a compromise that's good for our kids. It's good for parents who want their kids to learn English. It's good for kids who've been left behind because they haven't learned English in a failed system. Now the system will be so much better because parents will have choice.
Improving teacher quality is another focus of this proposal. According to the board's figures, about 27% of bilingual teachers are uncertified. Again, that vote is scheduled to take place any minute, and we will have the full story for you tonight at 11. We are live at the Board of Education in downtown Brooklyn. Carol Ann Riddell, News Channel 4.
This is the news leader, ABC 7 Eyewitness News.
An important vote tonight at New York's Board of Education. The board is dramatically changing bilingual education, and it will have a major impact on students and parents. Lucy Yang was there and has more.
New York City's bilingual program has been entrenched in the public schools for some 30 years, but it's about to be uprooted. Under the new plan, instead of pigeonholing students into a lifetime of bilingual classes where they may never become proficient in English, the goal now is that after 3 years, the child should be ready for mainstream classes and to end automatic placement into more bilingual classes. And throughout the process, parents would be given more choice. It is a contentious issue, but you wouldn't know it by the poor showing at tonight's Board of Education vote. Only 3 speakers came forward, not to condemn the resolution, but to warn about implementing it carefully so that students do not fall through the cracks. Moments later, the board embraced the new policy 7-0.
I vote yes for the resolution.
Ninfa Segura making her point in both Spanish and English.
Most important role a parent can play, making decisions regarding their child's future.
If you come to us in 9th grade not speaking English, you will have only a 1 in 10 chance of moving into a regular high school class after 3 years. We cannot forget these students whom we have not served well.
Now that the new policy has passed with flying colors, it is up to the chancellor to come up with a plan to put all this into practice and to come up with the tens of millions of dollars it'll take to pay for it. Outside the Board of Education building in downtown Brooklyn, Lucy Yang, ABC 7 Eyewitness News.
Watching NBC4, the Tri-State News Channel. And now, Chuck Scarborough, Sue Simmons, Janice Huff, and Len Berman. This is News Channel 4 at 11.
A major decision tonight on bilingual education for New York City school children. The new plan will give parents more choices for their kids. But as Carol Ann Riddell reports, critics are already questioning some of the changes.
This is an important day for public education for New York City.
By unanimous vote, the Board of Education decided to overhaul bilingual education in the city's public schools, a major shift affecting thousands of children. Bilingual education is intended to help children transition from their native language to English, but for years parents have complained it doesn't work because too many kids end up in bilingual classes indefinitely. sometimes for as long as 8 or 9 years.
What you're looking to do is have parents actively engaged in the decision, in discussion with the administrators and with the teachers as to what makes best educational sense for their child.
Chancellor Harold Levy quickly left the meeting without comment. Under the new plan, students will not be automatically placed in traditional bilingual classes. Parents will be given several choices, including English as a second language and accelerated English, which could involve after-school sessions. The goal is to have students speaking English in 3 years, but not everyone is convinced that's possible.
Some students can do it, yes. Those who came with some background already, but some cannot.
The board president says you can expect to begin seeing these reforms implemented in September, but there are a lot of unknowns. For one, it's not clear whether each of these different alternatives will actually be available in each school district, at least initially. And there's the cost. As of right now, the board is not sure how it will cover the $75 million price tag. At Board of Ed headquarters in Brooklyn, Carol Ann Riddell, News Channel 4.
Improving teacher quality is another focus of the new plan. Right now, according to Board of Ed figures, 27% of bilingual teachers are uncertified.
From New York One News, this is the 8 o'clock edition.
Major changes to bilingual education as the Board of Education votes to reform the system. Here's New York One's J.D. LaRocque with the details.
2 years ago, Mayor Giuliani called for the overhaul of the bilingual education system. On Tuesday, he achieved his goal. By unanimous vote, the Board of Ed approved a $75 million reform plan written largely by City Hall. It's designed to get some 150,000 students into English-speaking classes within 3 years.
What we heard from parents in Bushwick, Latino parents in Bushwick, is I want my child in a different kind of class. I don't want them in an extensive bilingual class. I want them to learn English faster. I want them to learn it in a different model.
Under the old system, most students were placed in traditional bilingual or English as a second language programs, where many languished for years. Under the new plan, parents will have 4 options. They can place their kids in traditional bilingual classes, in English-speaking classes, in intensive classes that teach English, or in so-called dual language programs.
What it means for students is an increased focus on those students who need the assistance, who need help. It means greater focus from this system and you know, teachers and principals and superintendents working with students to make sure that they are proficient and that they master English skills.
Some advocates said there may not be enough money to see the plan through.
But it's not clear that the children will get any better instruction, the majority of the children who are in ESL and bilingual programs, because until there's a real budget to improve those programs, the jury is still out.
Schools Chancellor Harold Levy had nothing to say. In an odd display, the chancellor refused to answer questions about the plan. Instead, he raced to his car and sped off into the Brooklyn night. Setting the chancellor's behavior aside, the vote was pretty sedate. The Board of Education has largely avoided the public firestorm that greeted bilingual ed reform efforts in places like California and Arizona. The changes here in the city will take effect this fall. In Brooklyn, J.D. LaRocque, New York 1.
From New York One News, New York City's only all-news channel, in association with the New York Times, this is This Week Close-Up.
Hello, I'm Alan Finder of the New York Times. Welcome to This Week Close-Up. So what kind of week has it been? The Board of Education voted to revamp its bilingual education program by a vote of 7-0. Mayor Giuliani's Decency Commission has yet to be chosen, but a U.S. Supreme Court ruling on another First Amendment issue may, in fact, have set limits on the government's ability to attach strings to public money for expressive activities, perhaps including these expressive activities. And this week, it seems it's not only Democrats in trouble, the state Republican Party is in some disarray, too. Joining me to discuss these stories and more are my New York Times colleagues, op-ed page columnist Bob Herbert, editorial board member Eleanor Randolph, City Hall Bureau Chief Elizabeth Bumiller, and Metro political correspondent Adam Nagurney. What a minefield that was. Welcome. And how appropriate that we should start with bilingualism for some of us who aren't even monolingual. And just for the sake of our viewers and my own peace of mind, let's conduct this only in English, if we will. This has been brewing for a long time. The mayor, among others, has been pushing to revamp the bilingual program. Bilingual program goes back to the early 70s, and I believe there's a court settlement and a series of things. As I understand it, what they're doing is expanding the options. They're certainly not ending bilingualism, which is apparently going on in other parts of the country, but they are certainly changing the way it's going to work and opening the options. How's it going to work?
Well, nobody knows exactly how it's going to work, and this court settlement that you talked about, I mean, nobody knows whether they have to deal with this again, because that in 1974 the courts in the city agreed basically that if you didn't pass this test, you would go into bilingual education, and then you would set up this huge bureaucracy to help people who didn't speak English well enough. Well,
I presume the impetus to all that was you didn't want a child, especially in a place like New York where people speak so many different languages, to sit in a classroom being instructed in English and not absorb any of it.
Well, that's right. And as a child gets older, it's more difficult. I mean, that's one of the real problems, is that you can, there's the sink or swim school, and then there's the school that just keeps you afloat, you know, forever, basically, and you don't learn English. So the middle school and high school kids are the ones that are going to have the most difficulty. This new program sets up 4 different tracks, if you will. There's the old bilingual track, and then there are 3 other options. Parents are going to get to decide, really, where they want their children to go. And hopefully by the, you know, when it gets into full gear, this will give some people learn, anybody who's tried to learn a language knows how hard it is for some people to learn languages. So some people can actually get into the sink or swim system and swim. And others really need a lot of help. And the real problem for the school system is going to be finding teachers, because this, say, middle school and high school teachers, because they're going to say have 1 day in Spanish and 1 day in English.
Alternating.
And so where are you going to find somebody who's going to teach? I mean, it may be the same teacher who can do this, but you've got to find this very specialized teacher who can teach, say, high school chemistry in Spanish, and fluent English. So that it just adds to the problems that the school system has.
And obviously, if you had 2 different people doing it, you'd have no continuity, since it's one course. You couldn't change people interchangeably.
I don't know. They could meet. You know, they could discuss things and meet.
Are there any estimates for how many kids would go into each of these 4 tracks? Which would be the most popular and
No, somebody said that the fact that it was a 7-0 vote made it clear that there were no details. You know, we don't know really what's going to happen quite yet. So
well,
I don't know.
And part of the problem with this has been pointed out. Part of the problem with this is that the child is not fluent in English, and the chances are the parents are not going to be either. And how well will the Board of Ed be able to inform parents about these choices and get parents to understand and get involved?
Well, that's true, except that, you know, a lot of immigrant parents send their kids to school and they think, aha, you know, my English is not very good, but my child will learn how to read. And then all of a sudden there's a 3rd grader who can't read in English. And so I think at some point, if it's done well, parents will be able to decide, I think, whether these kids need to be pushed a little bit more or supported more.
After all these years, do we have any studies that indicate what's a better approach? What works better than something else?
Swim, I would guess sink or swim, right?
Well, it works best in the early years.
Right.
I mean, the best thing is that if you're gonna be bilingual or start a new language, the best thing is to start a new language in the first 6 grades, because then it's easier. You know, people like, I tried to learn Russian when I was 140, and I can tell you it's very, very difficult. But if you get into high school, it's very hard to swim. You just sink, you know. And that's what caused this lawsuit 26 years ago.
What is the impetus behind this move, both here and around the country? There's obviously some suspicion that in parts of the Southwest and the West, that this is perhaps fueled by some anti-immigrant sentiment. It seems unlikely in New York that that's the case, although who knows. Is this because bilingualism hasn't worked, or is this a broader series of questions that are involved?
It is because bilingualism, basically, a lot of it hasn't worked. And it's also because you've got some societies that are set up around the country that people basically live in a world where they speak a foreign language in America. And there was this thing in the paper the other day about this guy who was talking to this little girl. He said, "Are you bilingual?" And she said, "Oh no, I'm trilingual because I speak 3 languages." And he said, "Well, oh, that's interesting. Well, what do you call somebody who speaks only 1 language?" "Oh, those are Americans." You know.
Is there, in fact, anything wrong with having someone come to this country, or to this city for that matter, and learn in fill-in-the-blank, Urdu, Spanish, French, and then exist in an immigrant enclave where that language basically gets you by?
Well, what if you want to be a citizen? What if you're going to go to jury duty? What if you need to vote? I mean, we know that how difficult it is. There are some ballots, say, in Chinese, but as I don't know whether you saw this, but in Chinatown, the last election, they had the Republican and the Republicans and the Democrats confused on the Chinese ballot. So
hard to believe there'd be electoral confusion in this country.
I don't think there's anything wrong with it per se, but long term, it's not great policy. Say, if we're talking about the city, it's not great policy for the city, because how do you then run your public school system? I mean, overwhelmingly expensive, potentially chaotic, and also what's the long-term ramifications for the city? So it's a tough call.
From New York One News, New York City's only all-news channel, in association with the New York Times, this is New York Close-Up.
I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to New York Close-Up. Tonight, a look at the various approaches to teaching the city's foreign-born school children. My New York Times colleagues Lynette Holloway and Mia Navarro, who've been reporting on bilingual education in the public schools, explain in just a moment. And later in the program, we'll be joined by the writer Dorothy Gallagher, her book, How I Came Into My Inheritance and Other True Stories. But first, bilingual education. Last week, the Board of Education voted unanimously to revamp existing programs. That vote doesn't end the controversy over what are the most effective ways to teach English to children who need that kind of help. My New York Times colleagues, Lynette Holloway and Mia Navarro, have been writing about the issues confronting both parents and children and teachers in the programs available to them in the public schools. Those stories appeared in the Times on the eve of the Board of Education's vote. Lynette, you wrote in the paper that there seems to be a great deal of inconsistency district by district and school by school, in fact, over what is offered, even what parents are seeking.
Yes. Sometimes some school administrators offer bilingual education programs and ESL programs.
ESL,
or
English as a second language.
Right, ESL is English as a second language. And it really depends on what the parents decide they want their, which program they want their child to be taught in. And also it depends on what how many teachers the school has.
The program that exists now was instituted pretty much as a reform originally itself. About 25 years ago, the city signed a consent decree saying that it was going to do a better job, in effect, of teaching students who did not speak English and merging them into the school system. What's wrong with the system as it now stands?
The inconsistencies in the way it's taught in the various districts, and sometimes they're about half and half, and half the students in the city are in ESL and half the students are in bilingual education. And some critics say that, like Mayor Giuliani, say that children are not learning English in bilingual education, and they are not leaving these programs, bilingual education programs. They're not leaving.
Mia Navarro, your story suggested that one size does not fit all. In fact, that a lot of parents have different goals, different aspirations for their children, and that includes how well they learn English and how quickly they abandon or perhaps forget the language they came here with or their parents came here with. What do parents want from the public school system?
I think it varies, and the parents that want their children to learn English as quickly as possible really shun the programs. the parents that feel, who feel that bilingualism is a good thing and that the schools could teach the kids their native language even better than they could learn it at home, tend to favor them. I mean, I found that a lot of parents really who favor bilingual programs are not as much interested in having the kid, is the transition, to English for the children. I mean, they're really interested in maintaining the native language because it is a different world now, and they feel, especially with the Spanish speakers, that, this country is going to be at some point 25% Hispanic. There's a certain comfort level among the Hispanic parents with Spanish and speaking Spanish that you may not find among other ethnic groups. So sometimes,
you were saying in the story that Russian Jews, for instance, aren't that interested in educating their children in Russian. They prefer them to learn English.
Right.
As
Although,
quickly as
frankly, we cannot generalize. I think you find all views within the different ethnic groups. But in some districts, administrators with the school system say that the parents, overwhelmingly reject the bilingual programs. And I think a big concern is that they feel the kids could be held back if they're segregated in bilingual, classrooms.
Do we have any sense as to how the education establishment as well as parents responds to this challenge now compared to a century ago or the beginning of the 20th century when we had so many newcomers in the public school system as well, people who came from other countries or their parents came from other countries and spoke only Italian or only Russian or Ukrainian or Yiddish or German or some other language. How were they brought into the system?
I think it was the sink or swim kind of method. And I think that's what some of the critics say now. Well, my grandparents learned and without any help. Why can't kids today learn?
And what's the answer?
Well, they say that most of the people, the proponents say, we are more sophisticated today. We should be able to help our children, and we do have the means, and we should be able to provide our children with help. And that's why bilingual education was established. And children back in the 70s, mostly Hispanic children here in the city, were sitting in classrooms not learning anything. And that's why the consent decree came about. That's how it came about. And that was the criticism.
I think it's also a matter of attitude. I mean, the earlier immigrants may have come here and totally forgotten about their native countries. I mean, they wanted to build their future here. And they were, for the most part, coming from countries that were very far away. Now the new immigrants come from countries that are very close to the United States. You have better transportation. They come back and forth. There are ties to the native country that these earlier immigrants may not have had. And I think that plays a role.
We hear a lot about what educators think, what parents think. What about the kids themselves? Are they mostly interested in getting to speak English and learn in English as quickly as possible, or do they have an attachment to the language they came here with or the language of their parents as well?
I think, you have a variety of views, too. I mean, I think, one factor that is very important is age. Because for the older kids, they have to pass state exams and city exams, and those are offered in their native languages. So if you come to this country at, 16, I mean, and you have to pass these exams, your concern, your priority is to learn content, in your native language so that you can then pass the exams. I mean, when you're talking about kindergartners, I mean, it's really, they absorb everything. It's much easier. It's a different ballgame.
I actually talked to a teacher the other day who said that in middle school, some of the children are afraid of leaving their friends behind in bilingual education, and they will actually flunk the test that determines proficiency in English deliberately to stay with their friends. So that's one of the things that we have to consider.
Lynette Holloway, Mia Navarro of the New York Times. We'll be right back after the following messages.
This is the news leader, ABC 7 Eyewitness News.
What are these teachers supposed to do? You saw those teachers in there. They look like they're not working. At some point you got to say enough already.
An angry schools chancellor issuing a warning tonight about trouble in New York City schools. And in tonight's Extra, how some communities are building new schools without raising property taxes. Good evening, everyone. I'm Bill Ritter.
And I'm Diana Williams. We begin with a warning about schools. New York City Schools Chancellor Harold Levy clearly frustrated today, upset about a lack of money for schools, especially when it comes to bilingual education. NJ Burkett is live at Board of Education headquarters in downtown Brooklyn with more on this story. NJ?
Diana, in a word, the school's chancellor was on a tirade over what appears to be a $75 million misunderstanding. Now, the chancellor says he was promised extra city and state money to expand bilingual education here in the city of New York. The mayor remembers it differently, but clearly the chancellor is mad. He says he's not going to take it anymore.
I'm angry that no one has paid adequate attention to this.
Harold Levy was so angry today, he hardly knew where to begin. He toured the after-school summer program at James Madison High School in Marine Park and even managed a smile or two. But the chancellor admitted that many long-awaited reforms in the city's bilingual education program may have to be scrapped. The mayor says the chancellor has already got the money. The chancellor says he was promised a separate allocation.
There's no misunderstanding here. From the very time that we all agreed that there would be a new policy that the Board of Education voted on unanimously, it says in the resolution, $75 million required to do this.
Mayor Giuliani said Levy's budget is big enough.
It's amazing to think that the Board of Education would complain about $20 million when the budget is $12.3 billion. So maybe they should organize themselves to do the management kind of things I was talking about, and then they wouldn't be complaining about $20 million.
The answer clearly infuriated the chancellor, who continued to insist that he barely has enough money to run the schools, much less improve the quality of education for the largest public school system in America.
We're going to open on time. It's going to be a smooth opening. I can manage that. That's because I have an ability to manage things. But what I can't do is promise that we're going to have improved performance. And that's very frustrating. And I'm about had it with this business of, well, but you can do it if you only tried. What are these teachers supposed to do?
Tonight, the Puerto Rican Defense and Legal Education Fund is considering a lawsuit to get the extra money for bilingual education, in essence, suing the city and the state for the extra money. Today, the school's chancellor did not rule out becoming a party to that lawsuit. Clearly, a new war of words is developing between City Hall and the school's chancellor. Live tonight, Board of Ed headquarters in downtown Brooklyn. NJ Burkett, ABC 7 Eyewitness News.